The result is that men will internalize their emotions, right? Internalize that sort of shame about them. And again, only express their emotions in unhealthy ways, right? He gives an example through sex, right? Perhaps being too aggressive in that arena, right? But we could imagine other forms of expression or violence, right? That would also result from someone not being able to embody or express their emotions in a productive manner. And I'll just share one more example of this from my personal life, where I was engaged in a debate with a member of my extended family about sexual harassment in the workplace. And I was trying to explain to this person why I would not want a male colleague, you know, coming over to, touch my shoulders, right? Just really basic, physical respect, right, in the workplace. And this member of my family was very upset because I'm guessing that whatever idea of interacting with women from their past was being threatened, right? Like they maybe felt like they had done something that maybe would now not be considered appropriate. So they were getting very defensive, and because they were not able to express themselves in a productive manner, they just started yelling at me like, fuck you, right? Like all of these terrible things. And it was like, whoa, like just this explosion of aggression simply by my stating that I don't want, other men to touch my body without my permission, right? Like a pretty basic thing. But that manifestation of his emotions could only come out in this way that he had perceived as acceptable, right, for being a man, right? He could not engage in any sort of explanation with me. And I just think he really didn't have the tools to do it, right? And so it manifested in this way. And so the conclusion here is not just that, right, simply Petrie is describing what's going on, but it's a normative one, that we ought not expect or encourage men to go through life in silence. Okay, and this leads us to Michael Messner, who talks about how these notions of masculinity really take on an interesting sort of amalgamation in politics. So this is a really interesting paper. I would encourage you to go through it in detail. I'm just going to highlight a few things from the remaining papers to try to keep this on the shorter side if we're not already going too long. So he uses here the example from Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? So a significant celebrity figure, not just in pop culture, but also in politics, right? And this notion of a kindergarten commando, which is meant to embody his character of a kindergarten cop. If you haven't seen that, you should. As well as the, traditional military figure with, all the machine guns, the commando part, very aggressive and violent. So kind of combining two elements into the specific type of masculinity that tends to be modeled in politics, at least historically. So again, right, he's referencing hegemonic masculinity. He talks about how this was dominant in the 1980s with this sort of violent tough guy persona, right? So this was a remasculinization, he says, in American society after the Vietnam War, right? Because because of what happened as a result in that war, right, many vets came back and were being shamed, right, because of the way society viewed the unjust nature of that war, and were just feeling very abandoned, right, and marginalized. And so this sort of overly macho man as weapon machine commando figure started to emerge in films, right, to sort of re-masculinize American men, and especially American military men, right, as a result of that. In the 1990s, though, this tends to be, again, we're seeing more women and more of a demonstration, right, of other types of identities. And so that commando was a little delegitimized, right, because it demonstrated an instability in reality, right, that, there has to be something wrong in order for the commando to be necessary, which we maybe don't always want to admit, right, that we need something like that. And also, of course, the context is going to matter, right? The commando is not going to be the appropriate form of masculinity in every situation, right? And so we started to see other types of masculinity demonstrated in the 90s, primarily in the private sector and business. And then we move into more humor in the late 90s, early 2000s, right? And the sort of self-mocking, caring, compassionate, but again, men were only seen as doing this under the right circumstances, and they would be seen as most often doing this if they were in charge of protecting children, and that's where we get something like the kindergarten cop. And so again, Messner is combining these two notions to say that really the type of masculinity we see promoted in politics is this amalgamation, right? So there has to be toughness, but there also has to be compassion, but it's not an equal relationship. In this concept of masculinity, toughness will always take priority and be the more important of the two characteristics, right? So the person always has to be tough, and they should be compassionate, but only in the right circumstances. And so again, this has been used, according to Messner, in national politics to stoke fear and insecurity of the other, right? And again, to give the idea that we need a man in a political position rather than the quote-unquote mommy state taking care of us. So again, this sort of delegitimizing and devaluing of femininity. And the idea that anyone in politics, right, who participates in this idea that to be an effective political leader, you have to make sure the public is afraid. You have to make sure they feel insecure so that they rely on you as their protector. And you should always be tough, but only be compassionate in the very rare circumstances, right? If you participate in that, you're complicit in that model, right? Which is, again, marginalizing lots of men and women.